I am going to tell you how I have achieved these effects, how I have convinced you. And if I am not upfront and clear with you about how I have done so, then I am failing you, and in a sense, I'm being dishonest. Our bond depends upon your believing that you have a sense for how it is that I've gone about bringing about these effects. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about how I go about trying to be transparent. Well, first, I try to be clear about my own self, my own investigator effect, how it is that I've affected the situation under study, how it is that my presence has influenced being on the sidewalk and the lives of those people. I try to...
Okay, I'm going to stop that there because it brings us exactly to where we want to be, which is to talk about, let's see,
out there. In this case, when I started out,
So we want to talk right now exactly about what Mitch Dunier was talking about, which is reactivity, or what we call the Hawthorne effect. So you'll notice that one of the things as a participant observer that Dunier has to think about is how is it that his own participation in this milieu influenced the things that people did. And if in fact people were influenced by his very presence there, and if that influence had a systematic effect on what he was finding, then in fact you have an example of the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect. So the Hawthorne effect, which is on the slide, is something that we call, give me a break. Sorry about that. The Hawthorne effect happens when the fact of the research itself changes the phenomenon that you're investigating. So here's an example. Let's say if Dunier was really interested in how the mostly racialized men perceived the white businessmen who would walk by and potentially buy books or not. If he asked the question himself, he saw he's like a white middle-class academic guy, that might change the answers that he got from the men that he asked. Maybe they would give a bit of a nicer account than how they really feel about the white businessman walking by. But they might feel awkward about saying that to the white interviewer, Mitch Dunier. So if that were the case, then what you have is a kind of Hawthorne effect, where the very fact of the experiment itself or the research itself changes the thing that you find. And that becomes a problem of validity, which we're going to talk about in a few seconds. So the Hawthorne effect is when the subject itself, the research itself, or the researcher actually changes the behavior of the thing that you're observing. Okay, most participant observation is exploratory. People begin with hypotheses. You hear that Dunier had this exploratory project in mind, and he believed probably that these men were a good thing for the community, and he went into the field with that kind of pet theory in mind, or that hypothesis. And what he found was more complex. Okay, now, talking to the nuts and bolts of issues around measurement. A few concepts. Variables. You probably know what these are, but in case you don't. So variables are concepts. Any concept that has multiple values. So as an example, race is a concept, and it has multiple values. There are many different kinds of races that one can identify with. Height is a variable. We come in virtually all heights as humans within a given range. So we're dealing with a variable when anything that we're looking at, whatever we're looking at, can change or has different values. So like income would be another example of a variable. Now, in order to establish a variable, you have to operationalize it. So what is operationalization? Well, as an example, let's say we want to look at class as a variable, one's class background. Well, the truth is, the way I think about middle class may be different than the way that you think about middle class, than the way that you think about middle class. And so we have to operationalize the concept, which is we have to come up with a fixed, systematic definition so that we repeatedly are measuring the same thing that we think we're measuring. So when you operationalize your concepts, you come up with systematic definitions of the thing that you're trying to examine. So maybe, as an example, we would operationalize class as follows. If you make up to $25,000 a year, between $10,000 and $25,000 a year, you're considered poor. Between 20 and 30, you're considered working class. Between 30 and 70, you're considered middle class, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be one way of operationalizing the concept of class. And of course, we have to defend that operationalization in the paper that we write with a research proposal and say why it is that that definition makes sense. Okay, reliability, a very important term. What is reliability in measurement? So if a measurement procedure yields consistent results, we consider it reliable. If it does not yield consistent results, it is not reliable. Here's an example of reliability, a very concrete one. Let's say you have a 50-pound dumbbell in your house, and you put it on your scale in the bathroom. And one day the scale tells you that that 50-pound dumbbell weighs 50 pounds. The next day you put the same dumbbell on the scale, and the dumbbell has gained 10 pounds, and now it's 60 pounds. The next day you put the dumbbell on the scale, and lo and behold, the dumbbell appears to have gone on a diet, and now it's 30 pounds. It dropped 30 pounds overnight. That probably tells you that the scale, your bathroom scale as a measurement instrument, is not reliable because you're putting the same fucking weight on the damn scale and it keeps giving you different weight. I swear my scale is unreliable like this. Up and down, up and down, up and down. I just scream, you're unreliable. And smash it, correct. Okay, so measurement instruments need to be reliable. Related to Mitch Dunier's research, how would we apply the idea of reliability? Well, Mitch Dunier finds A, B, C, and D. If you were the researcher and you were there on the street corner in New York City at that time, would you have found the same things, A, B, C, and D? If you did, then we could conclude that there's some reliability in these findings. But let's say you did not find A, B, C, and D on the street corner. Let's say you found M, N, O, and P. So we would have a contradiction then, and the reliability of the findings would be called into question, just like the scale. Okay, another key concept here is validity. So this one's a little tricky, but here's how I think about it. You have validity when the thing that you're measuring is what you think you are measuring. So you have validity when the thing that you're measuring is the thing that you think you are measuring. So I gave you an example a few minutes ago of Dunier asking the book vendors how they feel about white business guys. If the book vendors systematically lied because they wanted to be nice to Dunier, who himself was white, that would throw off the validity of what he thought he was finding. He thought he was finding the attitudes of the book vendors toward white businessmen. But if those vendors were systematically changing their responses and making them a little nicer, so as not to offend Denier, then in fact the findings that Denier would be collecting would be invalid, because they really weren't measuring the thing that he thought they were measuring. He thought, by asking people their attitudes toward the white businessmen, that he was getting their attitudes toward white businessmen. But what he was really getting was an artifact of him asking the question. That is, they were sweetening up their responses because they didn't want to offend him. So that would be a problem of invalidity, or a problem of validity. So validity is the extent to which the thing that you're measuring is the thing that you think you are measuring. And sometimes it's not always easy. Okay, one thing to note about reliability and validity. Often strengthening one weakens the other. So whether a measure is reliable has no bearing on whether a measure has validity. The two are totally different concepts. So you may think you're measuring annual income by asking someone how much they earn. Another interviewer could ask the same person and get the same result. I earn $50,000. I earn $50,000. So that would be potentially a reliable finding, because you got the same finding when you asked the same person what your income was, but maybe that person is lying through the teeth. So the finding is reliable but not valid, because the thing that you think you're measuring, the person's income, is actually not what you're measuring. What you're measuring is what that person wants you to think their income is. Okay, so there's a bit of a difference. It's like asking your partner, how many people have you slept with? You ask them at 5 different times over the course of a month. You pretend that you forgot about the other times you were asking, right? You pretend like it's a new question. Each time your partner says, I've only been with 3 other partners. Time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, time 5. You're a good little social scientist and you keep a notebook on these things. Right? So your finding might be reliable. It seems to be reliable when you elicit that question, you get the same answer. So it's like putting the 50-pound dumbbell on the scale and getting 50 pounds, 50 pounds, 50 pounds, 50 pounds, 50 pounds 5 times. But what happens if, in fact, that dumbbell is really 100 pounds? You're putting it on the scale, it's telling you 50, 50, 50, 50. So it's reliable, but it's not valid, because the actual weight of that dumbbell is 100 pounds, not 50. So when you ask your partner and they tell you, I've only been with 3 partners, and they tell you that over and over and over, that might be reliable. It might be valid if it's true, but we know it's not true. We know that your partner has been with 30 people. So the measure is invalid. It's reliable, but invalid. Okay. Usually the way to help improve the validity of a study is to seek external corroboration. So in this case, you would go around to all of the people that your partner dated, and you would ask them if they slept together, right? That would be one way. Age is a typical example here. You could ask me my age all you want, and I will always, under all conditions, lie. Okay? I will always shave off at least a decade or more, depending on my mood. So to get a more valid reading of my age, what can you do? Well, you could ask me, what's your year of birth? Because you see, that's a little trickier. And here's a little secret, by the way, if ever you want to know someone's date of birth, right? Don't ask them what their age is. Ask them what year they were born. Because most people don't sort of keep tucked away in their mind the year that they were born of the age they want to be. They just, they're going to have to sit there and calculate in their mind, well, I'm 1985 plus. Right? So that's one way. If they hem and haw too much, you know, you're not getting a valid measure. Now, of course, I have a variety of dates memorized that I can tell you to shave off a decade or 12 to 14 years, depending on my mood. So I'm a tougher nut to crack. In my case, you might have to see a birth certificate. You might have to do something like that in order to really figure out my age. So that would be even a more valid measure. So when you want to increase the validity of a measure, you often have to look to external corroboration to get it. Okay, generalizability. What is generalizability? Generalizability is the extent to which the thing that you find can be extrapolated and account for a broader set of phenomena. So if you do a study, and the finding of your study would hold across a whole broader set of cases, then you have the possibility of generalizability. You can generalize, you can take the finding from this study and then apply it to a broader case set. But generalizability is something that you have to prove, and it can be problematic, especially with a single case study or participant observation like Denier's. So as an example, let's pose a question using generalizability with Denier's work. So Denier went to New York City in the 90s and studied book vendors on the street. Let's say in Toronto, we get a surge of book vendors on the street that are sort of semi-legally there. Have you seen them? On Bloor Street? Or the Annex, okay? So the question is this. Did the things that Mitch Denier found in the 1990s in New York, those book vendors, do they apply to the things that we would find today on Bloor Street and in the Annex with the book vendors? Can you generalize from Denier's findings and say the particular patterns of things that he found there are similar and apply to the things that we find today here? If you can, then you have a generalizable finding. If you cannot, then you do not. So some say that the best science is research that is able to establish generalizability. Why? Because then we learn a lot more from a given study. If you can show the dynamics of race and class on a street corner for those who are sort of informally employed,